Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Each week, we'll sit down with an historian to discuss their unique insights into our early American past so we can learn more about who we are and how we can affect a better future. I'm really excited about this episode. It's our first episode, and I knew the episode needed to focus on Ben Franklin. I chose him as our show's namesake because he was such a dynamic individual. I mean, Franklin loved to learn, help his fellow man, and he played such an active role in the early American world that this podcast will explore. Now, knowing that I wanted to begin the podcast with an episode about Franklin, I seized the opportunity I had in July to ask Rich Newman, director of the Library Company, if I could feature the Library Company in my first episode. Rich not only enthusiastically agreed, but he asked two of his colleagues, James N. Green and Cornelia King, if they would join me for an interview too. Therefore, we can launch the Ben Franklin's World podcast with a 3-part series. In fact, as I'm really excited about this podcast, and as these 3 episodes provide us with such a fantastic survey of the past, present, and future of the Library Company of Philadelphia, which happens to be the oldest cultural institution in the United States, as well as being Benjamin Franklin's Library. I think I'm going to call the launch series the Ben Franklin's World Launch Spectacular. What do you think? It may be a bit crazy, but you'll learn that I'm a bit crazy, so I think I'm going to run with it. All right, back to episode 1. In this episode, we'll chat with James N. Green, librarian at the Library Company of Philadelphia and co-author of Benjamin Franklin, Writer and Printer. Today's episode is actually the first of our 3-part launch spectacular for Ben Franklin's World, so you'll want to make sure that you catch the other 2 episodes as well. But in this episode, Jim will help us understand what the Library Company of Philadelphia is, the role Benjamin Franklin played in founding the Library Company, and the important role the Library Company has played in colonial, revolutionary, and early Republic America. All right, without further ado, here's my interview with James N. Green.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us, we have James N. Green, librarian at the Library Company of Philadelphia. Jim has worked at the Library Company for more than 3 decades. In addition to writing publications and conference papers to familiarize the scholarly community with the Library Company's holdings, Jim has found time to develop exhibitions for the Library Company and to publish 3 long essays in the multi-volume series History of the Book in America, and co-author Benjamin Franklin, Writer and Printer. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Jim.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And we're delighted to have you. Now, with more than 3 decades of experience at the Library Company, it seems like you are the perfect person to tell us what the Library Company is and how you came to be its librarian.
How I came to be its librarian is a story that really says a lot about how this institution has evolved over the years. I'm going to be talking about the Library Company as it is and the Library Company as it was throughout this our time together. And there, in some ways, there's a lot of continuity, but there are also huge differences. The librarian of the Library Company, going back to our founding in 1731, was the person who ran the place, and for a long time, the only person who worked in the library was called the librarian. Now we have lots of librarians and other professional staff here. About 3/4 of our staff is professional, and so my job for a long time, I was just the sort of the person who coordinated all the efforts of the librarians and curatorial and conservation staff here. And the director, for a while I was called curator, and then I was called assistant librarian, but the director remained the librarian until about maybe 10 years ago, when our board decided that that wasn't really a very accurate reflection of the way our responsibilities are divided up, and also that when the director was going out to raise money and said, I'm the librarian, they would say, I want to talk to the director. So they decided to be realistic about it. And now our director is called the director, and I'm called the librarian. And that means that represents this difference between the people who are out there in the world trying to drum up support and the person who makes the big decisions. That's the director. I'm the person who tries to get all of our professional staff in sort of pulling in the same direction and balancing the needs of conservation and access or interpretation, that is, balancing the need to preserve rare books and manuscripts and graphics against the need to make them as available to the public as they possibly can be. And also, one of my sort of special projects going back almost to the beginning of my time here 30 years ago was our fellowship program, which is the way that I think we are our strongest tool for building strong relationships with the world of the academic world of scholarship, of historians and people who do historical humanistic studies in the time period that the library company serves extend across the whole range of disciplines. But for the most part, they're all sort of the fellowship program is the sort of umbrella that brings them in and that interprets the collections to them. So
the librarian does a lot of coordination. It historically was the only person who worked for the library company, but obviously that has changed now. And you mentioned that the library gives fellowships for research. Is it just a regular library that has books that people can borrow, or what is the institution? What is its purpose?
Well, yes, that's probably. I should have started by saying that what the library company is now is an independent research library which serves a very diverse public, but a lot of it is becoming professional historians or humanists doing historical studies. And so we are a library that is primarily for research. That means that you come here to read the books. We bring them to you. We don't loan them out. And so they're used under supervision in our reading room. And that's I suppose the definition of a research library is one where the collections are very rich and deep, but also where the research happens in the library for the most part. We also, of course, do as much as we can on the internet to make our collections available and accessible, but there's really no substitute for sitting down with the real things and finding what they can teach you.
I agree with you there. I always love having the touch of the paper and looking at the script in person versus online. Although when you can't make it to the archive, having it online is a nice feature.
I actually feel very strongly that the best way to do research now, and that's not. I mean, research is maybe a fancy word for almost any kind of learning or discovery process that people go through to answer questions or just to enrich their lives. But it's a process that begins with an interest or curiosity, and which takes you into historical sources, and that yes, you have to combine working with online sources with working with what we sometimes call material texts, because there's no telling what you're going to learn when you start to investigate, the actual books that people read and learned from and used as basic tools in their lives in historical times.
Yeah, and the library company has really deep collections, and part of that is because Benjamin Franklin and his fellow Junto members founded the library company on July 1st, 1731. It is Benjamin Franklin's library, and that is the reason we wanted to launch this podcast by talking to you. So could you tell us what the Junto was and why Franklin and his colleagues wanted to start a library?
Yeah, so now we're shifting gears to what the library company's history is, but I want to try to, as we talk, show how what we are now is very much a product of what we were then, as different as that might have been.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you.
So Franklin was a young man when he came to Philadelphia, and he found that it was a city that was in some ways lacking in public institutions, but also one where there were very few books. There were some big libraries that belonged to rich men who didn't share them, but there were no public libraries. There was no sort of adult education apparatus and opportunities. And one of the first things he did when he came to Philadelphia as a journeyman printer was to gather around him a group of mostly young men who were like him, working with their hands. They sometimes called themselves leather apron men, which refers to the fact that they were working in trades where they had to, wear work clothes to cover their better clothes, and where they got their hands dirty. So, and the object of their getting together was a kind of mutual support and improvement society, I guess you would say, and their goals were to sort of band together, to work together to improve their minds, to improve their sort of their ability to converse intelligently and express ideas, all these things that education is supposed to do for people, and but also to improve their communities, their community, and to improve their position in the community. These were three goals: improving your mind, improving your community, improving your position in the community. For them, were three goals that were completely woven together, could not be teased apart. And all of this, though, was based on knowledge. And for them, I don't think anyone ever used these words, but they very much, it's implicit in everything that they did and their writing and the thinking that lies behind the Junto and later the Library Company, is that knowledge is power, and that knowledge can be found in books, and really mainly in books. Obviously, there weren't all the other sources of information that we have now, and so they gathered together on Fridays. The Junto did, and a group of about a dozen or so men, and they talked about things that mattered to them, about practical knowledge, about how communities could be improved, and they kept running up against this problem that they didn't have any books. And so one of their activities, they had lots of activities, writing essays about what good could you do today, kind of thing. But they also set up a little library where they pooled their tiny individual libraries. Sometimes some of the members only had a book or two, but put them all together, and you've got something that is more useful to the whole than the individual books would be. Well, so this worked pretty well, except that people wanted their books back some of the time. They actually put them all together in the house of one of the members, and people would meet there, and then the collection just sort of like melted away because people wanted their books back, or they took them home and they didn't bring them back. And I think that this was probably a lesson that Franklin took very much to heart. And of course, he came from Boston, a place where they had a public library going back into the 17th century, but it wasn't a library that you could borrow the books from. You couldn't take the books home, and that libraries in the past that had been set up for sort of community libraries, one sort or another, usually didn't allow people to borrow, but if they did, they soon regretted it because libraries just melted away. So I think that the impulse of setting up the Library Company was to take the little library that the Junto members had formed from their own books and make it a more public institution, but also to set it up at a more formal basis, so that and the trick would be to come up with some way to make sure that the library was sustainable, to make sure that people brought the books back, to put it really simply. Well, this was in 1731, when Franklin, you might say, took this library idea public, they set up what Franklin referred to as a subscription library. And what he meant by that was that everybody who wanted to be a member of the library, wanted to participate in the library, would buy a share for the initial price was £2, which was not a outrageous sum of money, but it represented a pretty firm commitment or investment on the part of the people who put down that money, maybe a week's wages for a working man, something like that, a skilled worker. So they put down this money. They signed their name. The word subscription has to do with signing your name at the bottom of what we called the Articles of Association, which set out the sort of rules and bylaws of the institution. One of those rules was that anybody who had a share was welcome to take only so many books home, but welcome to borrow so many books at a time, and had to return them in a certain period of time. But if they didn't return a book that they had borrowed, then they had to pay for a replacement. If they damaged it, they had to pay for its repair. If they just didn't return it at all and didn't make good, they lost their share.
Is this the origin
idea was that
of library late fees?
It is very much so, yeah. But we didn't at the beginning. We didn't have the kind of fine system that we have today. It's just that you had to return the book or else pay for it. Well, so this was a way of making it very much in your interest to return the book. It was not because the librarian wanted you to return the book. It was because you wanted to return the book so that you wouldn't lose the money that you had in effect already put down by buying a share. Well, so this subscription scheme that Franklin came up with had never been tried, so far as I know, in a library before, and it's very hard to find other what you might think of as voluntary associations that were set up on this basis before the library company. And so I think that it's well known that this was the first subscription library, certainly in the British North American colonies, and maybe anywhere. But it made possible for the first time for a community library to be a lending library, and it also provided a sort of template for voluntary associations of all kinds, which later became quite a big thing in America. This is what we just the other day had some visitors from Iraq, and I was talking about voluntary associations and how many there are in America, and they said, yes, it's so amazing how many of these non-governmental voluntary associations there are in American society. There are a million of them. But this really was the first one. And so they say not only it wasn't the first library, it wasn't the first public library, it wasn't even the first library that lent books, but it was the first one that did all those things successfully. But to give one more sort of key to this argument about the community nature of the library was that after a few years, it seemed to be going so well. The number of shareholders was increasing, but there was an idea that maybe it was a burden to some people to have to buy a share for £2 in order to become part of this, and so they made it so that a new bylaw that said that anybody who wasn't a shareholder could still borrow books if they left a deposit with the librarian equal to twice the value of the book. And so here again is this financial investment, financial incentive to return books. And it's because of this that, and this is where the sort of link to what we are now, this library really did survive. It did hang together. It didn't lose its books the way other libraries did at that time. And so today we can be a research library mainly because we still have almost all the books we got over our 200 and almost 300 years of history. And there is no other early American library that has survived to that extent, and certainly none nearly as big as this one. And no other library that is such an accurate representation of what people were reading in the 18th century. And so that's why people, or 19th century, people come here today to study not just the books in the library, but also the culture of books and reading that existed. It was embodied in this library in the 18th or 19th century.
This is a really great story, and it says a lot about our history. You know, I can just see how some of our libraries today have adapted what Franklin and the Junto did with the library company and improved upon it over the years. And you mentioned,
in fact, I would go on to say that all public libraries in North America, up until the second half of the 19th century, were subscription libraries like ours. This was what public libraries were. The idea that a city should pay for a public library, that should be paid for out of tax revenues, was an idea that hardly even existed before the middle 19th century. And then beginning in about 1850, gradually, all the old cities and all the new cities in the United States got these tax-supported libraries. And now when we say a public library, we mean something a little bit different. We mean publicly supported and not just open to the public. But that was a much later development.
Well, I do have at least two follow-up questions on that. And one is what kinds of books did Franklin and the initial members of the library company acquire to help them improve, their artisanal culture, their way, ability to get ahead in the early American economy?
The word they kept using over and over again was useful books, and that means books that were tools that they could use in their daily lives, and that could be on any subject. But they were not particularly interested in learned books or books in foreign languages. They wanted books that told them how to do things.
So how-to books. There used to be a
bookstore. Yeah, there used to be a bookstore in Philadelphia called the How-To Bookstore, which is a great place. Another sad loss in the world of bookstores, but it's that kind of thing. It was a place where you could go to find out how to do things, or in this sort of improving your knowledge, improving your mind kind of sphere. You could say that there were books that just gave you solid information that you could use.
So the library company, not a place you'd go for early American novels.
Well, no, it wasn't, as a matter of fact. We had, in 1770, we published catalogs of our holdings regularly, and in 1770, the last catalog before the Revolutionary War, we had, I've forgotten exactly, I think we had 3 or maybe 4 novels in the library, and 2 of them were Don Quixote. Don Quixote in Spanish and Don Quixote in English, and also Robinson Crusoe was another one. So they were fiction was not terribly important in this scheme of self-improvement.
And Robinson Crusoe could be looked upon as a how-to book, how to survive in case you're overtaken by pirates.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and it's not just about how to survive. It's a novel about improvement. It's this castaway on what he thought was an uninhabited island has a very limited number of tools, and he deploys those in a very intelligent way to not just to survive, but to build a life. Well, that's a little bit like being in a colonial city like Philadelphia, where you have very few tools and everything is there that needs to be built. So that's an excellent point about another way that books can be useful.
And my second follow-up question is, it has to deal with the library company's name. You mentioned that in order to become a member, you had to pay a subscription fee. Is that why the library company is called the Library Company and not a library? Because often today when we think of company, we think of a for-profit business. But it doesn't sound like Franklin and his associates wanted to set up a for-profit institution.
No, absolutely not. You're right. The word company means something very different now. It means a corporation, I suppose, is a modern word that translates it best. But corporations in the 18th century were hardly ever profit-making. They're much more likely to be the opposite. They were much more likely to be an institution that is not making a profit, and and acting in the public interest, and so therefore is entitled to the privileges of a corporation, which is, say that the individual members are not liable for the debts of the corporation. That's one of the sort of legal definitions. But so in the 18th century, company really meant something closer to a voluntary association than to, in fact, or a voluntary cultural association, a nonprofit cultural association. These are better ways of translating company than, and the language of shares and this kind of thing too. I mean, all this has been adopted by profit-making corporations, but that didn't really begin to happen until after the Revolution, when the chartering of corporations was one of the powers that federal and state governments had for the first time.
Now, corporations and really kind of the world of literature and books in early America was really the realm of white men. Was the library company membership restricted to white men?
It was in fact, but not in writing anywhere. There was no expressed restriction on membership either by women or by non-white people, but that's the way it was for a long time. And the first women shareholders, first female shareholders of the library company, came to us by a merger with another similar library that did have several female members. And it's like the minutes just don't say anything about this. There's no debate about it. There's no even, I think, very serious interest in this fact. It didn't seem important to our shareholders then that there were women among them. And I think it's partly because that there's lots of indications in our archives of women borrowing books from the library, just using the share of their husbands or their fathers or their brothers. So it was not a place that was all male, but it was a place that was, as far as we can tell, was all white, and that's just a sad fact about what libraries were, what cultural institutions, what any institution was in the 18th and 19th centuries. In 1833, there was a group of free African Americans in Philadelphia came together and formed the Philadelphia Library Company of Colored Persons. It's an organization about which very little is known, just the names of some of the members, but it was a pretty clear indication of the sort of separation of the races in the 18th and 19th centuries, and also but also on the other hand of a sort of a recognition of the fact that everybody could benefit from the kinds of things that a library could do.
Interesting. Well, we only have about 5 minutes left, but during that time, I wonder if you could talk a bit more about any contributions that Benjamin Franklin made specifically. I mean, he made his livelihood as a printer. So did he print any books for the library company or sell any of his works to the library company?
A minute ago you asked about how to characterize the books the library company got, and there's another common fact about them all. They were all imported from England. This was not a library of American books. This was a library of books from the imperial capital, and it was very much a matter of diffusing the books of the center into the colonial periphery. Well, so and that's there were very few books in Philadelphia when Franklin started the library company. There were partly it was really almost, I would say, more as a bookseller than as a printer that Franklin sort of built up a trade in books in Philadelphia. He printed he printed newspapers, he printed almanacs. He was the printer to the library company, so he printed our little blank forms that you filled out when you bought a share. He printed our catalogs. But Franklin printed very few books, but what he did as a bookseller was import books from England, more probably than anybody else in the colonies. So by the 1760s, when Franklin retired from business as a printer, his bookstore was the biggest in British North America, and Philadelphia had become a place that was rich in books. And of course, the knowledge that he gained from being a librarian made him a better able to run a good bookstore, and vice versa.
And books, of course, help make Philadelphia feel even more cosmopolitan in the colonial sense.
Yes. In fact, in Franklin's autobiography, he says that, which is written, in part of it anyway, written before the Revolution, just before the Revolution. He said that there were now subscription libraries like the Library Company all over the colonies. He called the Library Company the mother of all the North American subscription libraries, now so numerous. And he said it was because of these libraries that he believed that Americans had been so both resolute and articulate, and also united in the stand they had taken against the British. And he said in another place, he said that because of these libraries, Americans are now more knowledgeable. An American tradesman is more knowledgeable than a titled gentleman in England. And I think that says a lot for his view of what the Library Company did. Was his claims for the importance of not only this library but the libraries that were patterned after it. His claims were huge.
He must have been. It sounds like he was really proud of his accomplishment in finding the Library Company.
He was, although it's typical of Franklin that he never wanted to be called the founder. He always said that he was one of a group of men that came together to form the library, and never that he was the founder. But we know, in fact, that he was the guy that came up with all the ideas and organized everybody. But this is one of his principles: how to start a voluntary association. Don't make it all about you.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned that the Library Company imported books. Franklin imported books from England. Now, what happens when England comes to Philadelphia? In September 1777, the British General William Howe and his soldiers capture Philadelphia from the Patriots. So did they use the Library Company while they occupied Philadelphia?
They hardly used it at all, and I think the reason for that is at that time the Library Company was on the second floor of a building called Carpenter's Hall. And this is another company, actually. The Carpenter's Company was a sort of association of builders and people who built houses, and the first floor of this hall was put into use by the British as a hospital almost as soon as they occupied Philadelphia. And that meant that you couldn't get upstairs to the second floor. The Library Company was on the second floor. You couldn't get upstairs through the hospital to use the library. So we basically closed it. And there was even a notice that we sent out that said members who want books from the library will have to get them at the librarian's house. So this was, a sort of blessing in disguise that there was no looting, no loss of books at all, as far as we can figure. But during the months that Philadelphia was occupied, the libraries functioned at a very minimal level. I have to say, everybody was pretty distracted by everything else that was going on.
Yeah, I can't imagine why they were distracted. so many things going on. But that actually, your story of Carpenter's Hall brings me into my last question, which is, I've heard that the Library Company has been referred to as the de facto Library of Congress. And I wonder if this is a true statement, and if so, how did or does the Library Company of Philadelphia serve Congress?
It is a true statement, and but it's based on this simple fact that during the period when the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia, we invited the delegates to use the library without having to buy shares, and we do. There's some indication of what use the delegates to the Continental Congress made, but we didn't keep circulation records. When you returned a book, the little slip of paper that said you had it out was handed back to you as a receipt. So we had self-destructing circulation records. So it's really sad that we can't say anything about we can say almost nothing about who used the library or what they read. But and then during after the war, during the time of the Constitutional Convention, we did the same thing, and then when the government moved to Philadelphia in 1790, we did the same thing again. So it was only when the government moved to Washington in 1800 that they decided they needed to start a library, and it became and it really, the idea of the library being not a national library but a congressional library is just an extension of what we did with Congress during the founding period. So yes, we were in effect the Library of Congress, and that's also, I think, a very good way of summing up what's important about our collections too, because we sometimes refer to ourselves, at least in our 18th century existence, as the delegates' library. It was the library that was the biggest library that was available to the founders, the biggest public library in North America, but it was also the one that really had everything that about it had every important book about politics, about public affairs, about history, about philosophy. Every book that the founders ever mentioned or referred to was here in the 18th century.
Wow, this has been a great conversation. I've learned so much about the library company. I'm now itching to get in there to do some research. But we like to respect our guests' time, and ours has come to an end. But just before we go, could you tell us where we should look if we ever want to find out more information about the Library Company of Philadelphia, its history, and its holdings?
You will find all of that on our website at librarycompany.org. That's library. Those words, Library Company, are all spelled out. No abbreviations or dots or dashes. And on the website, you'll find a history of the Library Company that is actually a book that we've just posted there called At the Instance of Benjamin Franklin. We have our online catalog, which gives catalog records for almost everything that we have, and at least all of our rare books. And then and also a lot of information about what our activities are, and exhibitions and programs and podcasts and things like that. Also instructions on how to apply for a fellowship, and lengthy descriptions about our various collection strengths. It's all on the website.
Fantastic, and I'll be sure to include a link in our show notes for this episode. Well, thank you so much for your time, Jim. We really appreciated it.
Well, it has been a pleasure, and I love telling the story, and I think I began by saying that the history of the Library Company is really, you can't really understand what we do today or what we're good for today unless you understand at least the basics about how we came to be, because libraries are like that. They're about building up collections that then last, hopefully forever, or at least long enough to be ever continually used in different ways and used in more ways than they were ever originally. The books that were used in different ways than they were originally thought of. That's one of the great strengths of a historical collection like this.
And yours has been around for 283 years. So
I was groping for that number before. Yes, 283.
Right.
That's our age.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. Maybe we'll be able to have you on the show again in the future, and you can tell us a lot more about the Library Company.
Well, I would appreciate that opportunity, and thanks for listening.
Wow, I could talk to Jim for hours. He's so knowledgeable about the Library Company and other aspects of early American history. I was fascinated to learn that the Library Company has influenced how our modern public libraries operate today. You? I also enjoyed learning about how practical Franklin and his fellow tradesmen were. I love to learn how to do things, so a whole library filled with how-to and practical books seems like a dream. Now you can find information about Jim, the Library Company, and everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, which you'll find at benfranklinsworld.com/001. Now, please remember that although our conversation with Jim has ended, our discussion about the Library Company of Philadelphia has just begun. There are 2 more episodes in our Ben Franklin's World Lunch Spectacular. Episode 2 features an interview with Cornelia King. Chief of Reference at the Library Company. And Connie's going to chat with us about how the Library Company hosts its history exhibitions. And in episode 3, we'll speak with Richard S. Newman, director at the Library Company of Philadelphia. In episode 3, Rich shares information about the past and present efforts of the Library Company to serve the public at large. And as the Library Company has existed for over 283 years, this is a very interesting conversation. If you enjoyed today's episode, please tell your friends about us. We won't be listed on iTunes or Stitcher until December, so please send them to benfranklinsworld.com so they can discover more about our show and download all of the episodes. And finally, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about the show or what I can do to improve it, please let me know. Send me an email to liz@benfranklinsworld.com or tweet me @Liz Covart. I really want this show to be great, so whatever you think I can do to improve it, I'm willing to try. Well, thank you for joining me. So please check out episode 2, and we'll chat with Connie King.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.